continuing your history this year. Today we will start with the lesson Sources of History. Now, what are sources of history? Sources of history at the most basic level are something that tells us about history, that is the past. It may be a document, book, or an object. They help in the construction of or to gain knowledge of past events, inventions, cultures, civilizations, etc. In this lesson, we are going to study the sources of modern Indian history. Now, what do we mean when we say modern Indian history? Here we refer to the period in India beginning with the age of industrialization in early 19th century. Modern Indian history is considered history of India from 1850 onwards. The sources of modern Indian history can be divided into material, written, oral, and audiovisual sources. Now let us see the first type of sources of history, the material sources. Various objects, monuments, places, coins, sculptures, etc. can be included in the material sources of history. Material sources give information about contemporary history, architecture, nature, economic conditions, political conditions, social conditions. Let's move on to material sources, which are buildings and places. The modern Indian history is believed to be a period of European rule, especially British rule. The buildings that were built during this period, many of them are still intact today. When we are talking about these buildings, we are talking about things like bridges, roads, water supply system, fountains, government offices, residence of officers, leaders, revolutionaries, palaces of rulers, of princely states, forts, prisons, etc. These monuments give information about the architecture, economic condition, history of the period that it was built in. Just as during the visit to Cellular Jail in Andaman, we get information about the revolutionary work of Veer Savarkar, by visiting Mani Bhavan in Mumbai, we get information about the history of Gandhian era. Now we move on to material sources, museums. Now museums are also an important source of history. What are museums? Museums are those places which care, preserve and display artifacts and other objects of artistic, cultural, historical or scientific importance. For example, the Aga Khan Palace in Pune. Here we see different objects, documents giving information about the life of Mahatma Gandhi. Students, let's now move on to the next material source, which is statues and memorials. Now, statues and memorials of many personalities and various events were constructed during this period. These were constructed to remember the person or the event. The display plaque on the statue provide information about the person or the event. They give us information like full name, birth and death details. Even if sometimes this display is not available or cannot be understood for some reason, the very fact that there is a statue or a memorial of the person or the event shows that it has some importance. Now, let's move on to the written sources of history. On the screen, you will find some written sources of history. Let's try to understand them. Correspondence. Correspondence are basically letters which were written from one person to another. Periodicals. Periodicals are magazines or newspapers published at regular intervals. Foreign accounts are records or information which were written down by foreign travelers who came to India. Factory records are policy decisions, worker records, etc., which were maintained by the respective factories. Autobiographies, biographies, students, I think you should know by now what it is. It has already been done in English. Do you all remember? What are autobiographies? Autobiographies are accounts of a person's life which is written by that person itself. And biographies are an account of someone's life which is written by someone else. Books are those books which were written during the particular period that is being studied. Which period are we studying now? We are studying the modern Indian history. Let's see which is the first type of written sources. The first type is newspapers and periodicals. Now students, we have all seen and read newspapers. Can you tell me what do we normally find in newspapers? Newspapers and periodicals provide information about political, social, economic, cultural happenings of the period. Newspapers and periodicals provide information about events, views of different people, etc. When we study old newspapers, we get information about the period when these newspapers were published or printed. If we study newspapers of the British period, we understand what were the political events or what was the political conditions during that period. Newspapers during the British period were not only source of information about political events, but they were also used as an instrument of social reformation or social change. Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar started a number of newspapers. He started a fortnightly called the Muknaik. Now, what is fortnightly? Fortnightly means every 2 weeks. So, this paper Muknaik was published every 2 weeks. He also started newspapers Bahishkrut Bharat, Janta and Prabuddha Bharat to bring about social change in society. Now, let us move on to the next written source, which is maps and drawings. Now, on the screen you will see 2 maps. The first map is a map of India before independence, and the second map is the map of India at present. This is how currently the political map of India looks like. Okay, when we look at these 2 maps, what do we see? We come to know how the geographical boundary of India has changed over time. The changing nature of a city or a country can be traced through maps. In the same way, the plans made by an architect are also an important source to understand the different phases of development. Now, why do we say that the plans made of architect are important? Because when an architect makes any plans for any kind of structure, he studies or he takes into account a number of things. For example, the economic condition. When we say economic condition, he has to consider whether the person who is going to construct that particular structure will be able to afford or can pay for this structure. Can he pay for the material which they will be using? In the same way, the architect also takes into account the current social atmosphere or the current social conditions and political conditions which exist in the particular area where the structure is going to be built. Okay, with this we conclude explanation for the written sources of history.